Our next speaker is Dr. Robert Rountree. He is an MD. After graduating magna cum laude from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro in 1976, Dr. Bob Rountree received his medical degree from the University of North Carolina School of Medicine at Chapel Hill in 1980. Dr. Rountree began his professional career at one of the first integrative healthcare centers in the U.S. and has been practicing family medicine in Boulder, Colorado since 1983. He is a longtime medical editor and columnist of 2 medical magazines. He has co-authored numerous books and book chapters on integrative and nutritional medicine, and he has lectured worldwide. In addition to his clinical practice, Dr. Rountree is one of the chief medical officers for Thorne Research, a world leader in the development and manufacturing of pure, high-quality nutritional and botanical supplements. He is also a longstanding member of the core faculty for the Institute for Functional Medicine, and in 2015 received the Linus Paulding Functional Medicine Award. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Rountree.
The first thing I want to do is tell you the subtitle of this talk is The Total Toxic Load and Its Impact on Health. All of the things that people told you in the past were good for you, that turn out to not be so good for you. Okay, so that's the subtext. I also want to call out my good friend Steve Coral, who I think a lot of you know. I'm really sad that he couldn't be with us. He passed away last year, and Steve is a lot of the reason that I'm here. I've known him, and been an honor, a pleasure to work with him for many, many years. And so I just wanted to dedicate this lecture to Steve. Disclosures, yes. What can I say? I mean, he was a hell of a guy, really. Disclosures. So I don't have any financial interest in a product or with any companies that offer grant monies for this continuing dental and medical education program. I do consult for Thorne Research and for Balchem Albion Labs, so that's my disclosure. So my first question is, when you see this picture, how do you feel? Yeah, okay, so I'm getting a pretty good read on the audience, right? Some audiences I would show this and they would say, oh, the future. Agriculture, the green revolution. Isn't that wonderful? But if you know a little bit about what's happening here, it starts to give you a funny feeling in the pit of your stomach. Dr. Doom, I told you. Dr. Doom. Well, here's some principles that we have put together that are based on really solid science. And the reason I want to emphasize that is after hearing the first 2 lectures this morning and then, seeing study after study on mercury and the toxicity of mercury, realizing how problematic it is. And then I hear Dr. Haley say, but I still can't get grants to do research because nobody thinks it's toxic. That to me was just an extraordinary thing. And that's why I wanted to show you the picture of the plane spraying the pesticides because, we're in a little bit of a bubble here. I'm kind of preaching to the choir, right? But what the object of what I'm doing here is to give you some talking points so that when your colleagues say, that's nonsense. There's nothing to this toxicity thing. It's made up. What I want to do is give you a little bit of a perspective on how you can respond to that. So to that end, we put this together at the Institute for Functional Medicine, kind of a series of logical thoughts that are based on really good research. Number 1, without a doubt, exposure to synthetic and metallic environmental toxins starts in the womb and continues throughout our lives. It's lifelong, and this is increasing. The exposure around the world is increasing. Number 2, the total body burden. When you put all of these together, the total body burden can act synergistically. It does not make sense to study individual toxins and think that's the end of the story. Number 3, in susceptible individuals, the physiologic dysfunction you get from this total body burden can lead to chronic disease. And it's important that we say in susceptible individuals because the studies really need to look at that and not just the population at large. What determines susceptibility? Well, you heard Dr. Shea talk about phase 1 and phase 2 enzymes, our ability to biotransform, our ability to excrete. Everybody is biochemically different, genetically different, and that determines susceptibility. And then finally, we believe that lifestyle changes and certain nutraceuticals can help modify the situation. So even if the total toxic load is overwhelming, there's things you can do about it. And I will touch on that at the end of the talk. So a lot of what we think about modern toxicology came from this guy. He was a bit of a jerk. Paracelsus was a bit of a jerk, but being a bit of a jerk allowed him to get past the notion which occurred before him, which was that all illness was a result of imbalances in the 4 humors. Right? The black bile, yellow bile, right? That's how everybody thought. And Paracelsus said, you know what? I think there's things in our environment that make us sick. And I think some things can make us acutely sick, and some things can make us chronically sick. So it was really groundbreaking that he came up with this notion, but then we got stuck with it. So there's good things about it, and there's bad things about it. Here's what Paracelsus said. All substances are poison. There isn't anything that isn't a poison. We can talk about water or oxygen. The right dose differentiates a poison from a remedy. Hence the notion of a threshold. Hence the notion of linear toxicity, which you heard about yesterday in the talks on hormesis from Dr. Calabrese, is one of my longtime heroes. So the standard risk assessment for chemicals is the no observed effect level. Okay? And how are these studies done? They're generally based on short term. So think about studies done on glyphosate found in Roundup. You do it for a short period of time in the rats and you say, gee, no problem. Roundup must be safe. But some research was done out of France where they extended those studies to the lifetime of the rats. And you know what? They all developed tumors. So the short-term thing is really important to understand. It's based on a linear assumption that nothing changes except the concentration. And we'll talk about why that's a problem. Also, these studies were done based on the assumption that every human being has exactly the same chemistry for detoxification. Everybody eliminates the same way. Well, I know that's not true, having been in clinical practice for 37 years or so. You know, I have guys that come in, why are you here? My wife made me come. Right? Tell me about your elimination. It's just fine. Well, when's the last time you had a bowel movement? Can't have been more than a week. Right? You ever hear that? Everybody is a little bit different. And especially this NOEL ignores the fact that during certain changes in life, during puberty and menopause, there are major changes afoot. And you've got to study those changes in life if you really want to understand what's happening. The other problem with this no observed effect level, the linear model, is it doesn't look at cumulative effects over time, right? You give this one dose one time, or maybe you give it for a couple of weeks, but you don't look at what happens over a lifetime. And it completely ignores the total toxic load. I didn't really hear Dr. Calabrese yesterday talking about the effect of multiple toxins. What happens when you mix DDT and dioxin together? Because that's really what makes the difference. Also, a lot of the research that's been done has not looked at transgenerational effects. And we know that we can expose rats to a certain toxin and effects will show up 2 generations down. So we sometimes don't look for these subtle things over time. So you all know about lead, and I would venture to guess that if I said, do you think lead is safe? Most of you would get that feeling in the pit of your stomach, right? We all know that lead is a problem, but it hasn't always been that way. My wife and I were in Bath, England last year, and we were looking at the lead pipes that the Romans built to carry water. People thought it was the greatest stuff on earth. They put wine in lead glasses. You know why? Because it makes the wine taste sweet. Isn't that great? Doesn't that make you feel really confident in the people that determine these things? Of course, when you see a picture like this, you go, well, I know that's a problem. I mean, these are kids, when you throw your batteries away, where do you think they go? They end up in these recycling plants in Bangladesh and places like that. And unfortunately, you have these kids that spend their whole lives just wallowing around in these batteries, just horrible pictures that you see. And it makes you think about what's happening to their brains, developing along those lines, right? I mean, these are kids that really have a horrible life. Does it happen here? Look at this ad. This is from Dutch Boy Paint, which is full of lead. The house that Jack built. And then at the bottom it says, don't forget the children. Someday they may be customers. And when I read that, I thought, you mean customers of the neurologists? Right? Customers of the psychiatrists? Right? That tells you how far we've come, because it used to be thought that lead was a really good thing and that it took huge exposures for it to be toxic, even though we knew from the days of the Romans that it caused toxicity. Well, the guy that changed all that, his name is Philip Landrigan, one of my all-time heroes. And Dr. Landrigan, he's a pediatrician from Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York, he teamed up with another fellow named Herbert Needleman, who's a child psychiatrist from Pittsburgh, and they went down to El Paso, Texas to study what had been described as this huge problem, a cluster of kids with bad neurologic problems that live near a lead smelter. And so they went down to El Paso and they started studying kids that live near the smelter and farther away from the smelter. By the way, in my medical training, I was taught to do a toxicological evaluation. And that toxicological evaluation consisted of asking one question. Ever lived near a smelter? And if they said no, we're done. Right? That's all the training that I got. I had to learn all this stuff myself. So Dr. Landrigan and Dr. Needleman went down to El Paso, and at the time what they were laboring under was the notion that poisoning was all or nothing. Either you got really sick from lead or you didn't have a problem. So what they did is they mapped out where people lived near the smelter. And then they looked at the kids' IQs and they did neurobehavioral tests on them. And they found out that even kids that were living way away from the smelter still had neurological problems. Still had problems. And that changed the whole way of thinking. I can't even tell you how much of a sea change that was, because back then people still thought that lead was fine for most people. So they call this new type of toxicity, quote, subclinical. Now, is this ringing any bells? Is this sounding a little bit like the mercury scenario? Because that's exactly why I'm telling you this. Well, you know what happened? They published their research. And what was the response? You people are quacks. With Herbert Needleman, who did very elegant research, they basically tried to take away his medical license for quackery. Because everybody knew that lead was fine. They knew that lead was fine. So they basically tried to run him out of town. And there was one woman in particular who was paid by the companies that make the lead, that put it in the paint, that put it in the gasoline. And she went out of her way to write scathing reviews of his work to say, his work should be retracted, that it was terrible. But he persisted. Way back then, it was considered that you could have around 40 micrograms of lead per deciliter of blood, and that if you had less than that, you're probably okay. More recently, the CDC is saying 10 micrograms per deciliter is lead poisoning. Right? So that was the norms. Oh, if you're below 40, you're fine. And then over time, we keep going down and down and down. Does this sound familiar? Yep. Same kind of scenario. This is from the New England Journal of Medicine. Blood lead concentrations even below 10 micrograms per deciliter are inversely associated with children's IQ scores at 3 and 5 years of age. This suggests that more U.S. children may be adversely affected by lead than previously estimated. So we just keep going down on that level, don't we? Maybe a little bit less and a little bit less is a problem. And then we have this situation in Flint, Michigan, where people are poisoned by drinking water, and they keep telling the authorities, we're not feeling well. Oh, you're just making it up. There's nothing to it. And then it took, how long? A year and a half of people drinking this contaminated water before anyone took them seriously. And then they finally went in and started studying it and finding out huge amounts of people were getting lead poisoning from old pipes. So it takes a lot. First of all, lesson from that. Should we wait for the government to come up with new standards? Right? It's got to be grassroots. It's got to come from practitioners who are saying, this is what I'm seeing in my practice. This is from, I was on a trip coming back from Europe recently, and I was reading The Economist on the plane, and I found this quote, 500,000 Americans have elevated levels of lead, 5 micrograms per deciliter. Oh, they just cut it in half. Wow, so is it going to go down to 2, 2.5? How about no lead? How about 0? Anything above 0? You know what? When I order mercury, heavy metal levels from Quest Diagnostics, I get a report back, and it says, here's your mercury level, and then it says normal range for fish eaters or non-fish eaters. And if you're a fish eater, your normal range is higher. And I'm like, so that makes it safe? Is that crazy? So here's what they're saying about lead. Over time, small daily doses add up to toxic concentrations, resulting in stunted growth and mental retardation. Kids drinking lead-contaminated water, as in Flint, Michigan, or eating, they eat the paint. Right? I saw this growing up in the South, where kids would just peel the paint off the walls, and they'd eat the paint for God knows what reason. So this is long-term chronic effects. And that led Dr. Stephen Gilbert, who wrote a wonderful book that I would recommend to all of you. How many of you know about this book, A Small Dose of Toxicology? You can download this for free. Highly recommend it. He says it's not nearly as important to know how much lead will kill a child as it is to understand the sensitivity of the child's developing brain to even low levels of exposure. So again, the point is there's a sea change in understanding what's going on. Well, this just came out in Lancet about 2 weeks ago. Low-level lead exposure and mortality. They tracked 14,000 adults for 20 years. And they looked at people whose blood level was in the 90th percentile and determined that that had caused a 37% increase in all-cause mortality and 70% increase in cardiovascular mortality. Based on this, 412,000 deaths a year can be attributed to lead contamination. So this is not a problem that's gone away, right? This is a problem that is very much with us, and that's just one metal. Shall I go on? Right? It's like, the question is this woman super sensitive, or is she just smarter than the rest of us? Right? I mean, every time you go to the hardware store, or even to the grocery store, it does smell a little weird, doesn't it? And what is it that's in the air? Well, we know that since World War II, we've made over 85,000 new synthetic chemicals. We're averaging about 2,000 new chemicals a year. And how much testing do you think is done on these chemicals? Almost none. You know, maybe wave it by the rats, and if they don't kill over, well, the rats didn't kill over, so we can put it out in the public. There are about 3,000 chemicals for which we make over 1 million pounds a year. And do you know where they end up? In us. Because we are rent-free storage facilities. Doesn't cost anything. And what kind of chemicals are we talking about? Pesticides, plasticizers, perfluorooctanes, that's Teflon, industrial pollutants like dioxins, pigments, paints, dyes, preservatives, flame retardants that are in the foam of our sofas, petrochemical fuels like perchlorate, solvents. We're swimming in this stuff, folks. We're swimming in it. Why aren't we all dead? Well, we will be, eventually. But clearly, we've got some kind of ability to fight it off. So part of the reason we have this problem is because we don't like bugs and we don't like weeds. So we got to let's just get rid of all of them. Let's sterilize the soil and let's get rid of all those darn bugs because they bite you and it stings and it itches. Right? And, I'm only half joking. I've had malaria. I got malaria in Africa a number of years ago. It really wasn't fun. And I understand that a lot of people die from malaria and kids get cerebral malaria. It's a problem. So when they came up with DDT, the Nobel Prize was awarded to Paul Mueller. He got the Nobel Prize for DDT. I would venture a guess, though, if I say DDT, you probably get that feeling in the pit of your stomach, like, ew. There are people that are saying we should bring back DDT. Bring it back. How about nets? Mosquito nets. They work pretty well, and they're non-toxic. So here's the issue. We don't like bugs, and we don't like weeds, so we make these pesticides. You know how many we make? At least 1 billion pounds a year. That kind of boggles your mind, doesn't it? 1 billion pounds a year, most of them used for commercial purposes. But what about golf courses? Do you live near a golf course? A lot of people do. They spray them on trees. We have a bug infestation in Colorado, so they just spray the whole forest. Doesn't that make sense? There's something like 350 different pesticides approved to use on food. The problem is only 0.1% of those ever get to the pests. So that means we spray 99.9% of it into the air. So that means that these pesticides are now contaminating every living thing on Earth. There's no place you can go on the planet where you don't find pesticides in the body fat of mammals. You find it in seals in Antarctica and the Arctic. It's all over the planet. And here's the problem. I'm going to do that again just because it's fun. Endocrine disrupting chemicals. So watch that and watch that. Nobody ever thought when they came up with DDT, they were all, invested in like making it stop the bugs, right? Nobody ever thought, boy, I wonder if the body would get confused. If there was a little bit of this in the body fat, in the circulation every day, I wonder if the receptors for estrogen might occasionally make a mistake and go, gee, is that estrogen or is that some synthetic chemical around? Well, do you think little girls are going through puberty at an earlier age? Is that my imagination? Or the imagination of the people that wrote this article in Time magazine? No. Things are changing. Right? Something is changing in our society. We've got epidemics of all kinds of hormone-related disorders. And one of the most obvious ones is that girls are going through puberty at an earlier age, but sperm counts are dropping. Sperm counts are dropping. So there's something that's interfering with our hormones. Well, look at this paper. Serum DDT, age at menarche, puberty, and abnormal menstrual cycle length. So they just measured DDT levels and they found an association. Higher DDT led to having puberty at an earlier age. I'm not saying that's the end of the discussion, but it certainly raises a point. Here's this chemical that we thought was good for us, that we released in huge quantities in the environment, and it wasn't until years later that somebody said, ew, maybe that's an issue. Oh, DDT is good for me. This is how it changes. And again, is this a little analogous to mercury, right? So sounding a little bit like the current scenario. It's good for you today, and all the major forces are lined up against saying anything differently. And then one day somebody goes, okay, here's the definitive evidence, and suddenly it all comes tumbling down. Now, the biggest issues we have to deal with are these persistent organic pollutants. DDT is a really good example of them. What they didn't realize when they came up with these things was that they would stay in the environment basically forever, which means that if you've got a woman that was sprayed with DDT when she was a child, and then she grows up and gets pregnant and breastfeeds, that breast milk is going to have DDT in it. Because it stays in your body forever. It stays in the soil for 50 or 60 years. And as I said, we can find these organochlorines like DDT, dieldrin. We can find them in every living thing on the planet. A number of years ago, they used to do the national what was it called? The National Human Adipose Tissue Survey. So they do fat biopsies on people around the country, and they found that 100% of people had styrene, benzene, xylene, dioxin, PCBs. 90 to 100% of everybody had this. So you know what the government did with that information? They said, we need to stop doing these surveys. I'm not joking. They cut all the funding. They said, oh, this is annoying and disturbing. We better stop doing this. So here we have this problem of chemicals that are hardly being studied, that are staying in the environment, that magnify up the food chain. So when you have, the big animals eating the little animals, they concentrate. So if it gets into the grass, and then you have the rodents eating, eating the grass and the bugs, and then the bigger predators eating the rodents, and then the larger animals eating the predators. You see how it goes up the chain, and the same thing happens in the oceans. And the problem is that these things are immune toxic, and they're obesogens. They're obesogens. They disrupt the signaling mechanisms that tell us when to stop eating. They disrupt the signaling mechanisms that tell insulin when to work properly. Now, we have an obesity epidemic because a lot more people are sitting at their desk all day. They don't have time to work out. But is that the whole story? Maybe these chemicals are playing a role. So, I want to address this issue of hormesis, because some of the studies in isolation make it appear that in low doses something like DDT or dioxin may actually be good for you. That's not really what the studies are showing. They're showing that at very low doses, not only is it not a linear thing, right? So with linear, the higher the dose, the more the toxicity. And then you get to a point where you don't see any toxicity, you don't see any effect, and then you get to this point with really low doses where what you see is not really beneficial, it's a stimulatory effect. Something is happening because they're binding to hormone receptors. I showed you that picture of DDT and estrogen. There's confusion on the receptor level. So the guy that's done the research on this, a lot of it, his name is Tyrone Hayes. He's at UC Berkeley. He's the world's most the highest authority on amphibians, right? He knows more than anybody about how to grow frogs. Amazing guy. So a company called Syngenta that makes a chemical called atrazine went to him and said, we know atrazine is safe. And he said, how do you know it's safe? And they said, because we've been selling it. We know it's safe. Atrazine is basically in the water supply all over the Midwest of the country. So they said, we know it's safe. We'd like you to do a study to prove that it's safe. That's really what happened. You can't make these things up. You can't. So he puts the stuff, the atrazine, in the water tank of the frogs. And you know what happens? The frogs, the male frogs, instead of going, ribbit, ribbit. Now that's important, ribbit. That's how they get the babes. Right? Ribbit. That's, when the women hear that, they go wild. So he puts the stuff in the water supply, and you know what the frogs do? Ribbit. And the women go, not for me, dude. You're not my guy. You might look big and tough, but we know what's happening. So, he went back to Syngenta and said, I found a problem. And they said, no, you didn't. And he said, I'm going to publish this research. And they said, if you do, we're going to run you out of business. And he said, well, I'm publishing it anyway. And they did everything they could to discredit him. And now it's been very well proven. So what he found is that was just one. He just started with atrazine, and then he started looking at other combinations. And this is an article he published in 2006 that he says, estimating risk based on studies that only look at a single chemical at a high concentration grossly underestimates the role of pesticides in the decline of amphibians. And I grew up in South Alabama. It used to be covered with frogs all the time. Every spring, you would smush the frogs walking down the street. Where are they? Now I see a frog, I'm like, a frog! Take a picture! It's like when tourists come to Colorado and they see a deer and they're like, a deer! I'm like, yeah, they're eating our crops in the yard. So, in Dr. Hayes' study, they found toxicity at levels of 0.1 parts per billion. An average farm worker has 2,400 parts per billion of these chemicals. Dr. Hayes estimated that he could take dilute urine from one farm worker and castrate 720,000 frogs. From the urine, one urine sample from one farm worker who's got a mixture of all these chemicals. So again, the hormesis thing is the start of the story, right? It says at low doses, there's an effect. Beneficial or not, there's an effect. It's a hormonal effect. What happens when you take low doses of multiple chemicals and you start putting them together? You get into trouble. So what does industry say in response to Dr. Hayes? There is insufficient evidence that pesticides harm frogs. Well, where are they? Where did they go? They're disappearing, right? Like Rachel Carson was talking about she talked about DDT and the bald eagle. And that's the reason she got the attention, is because the eagle eggs were cracking. We almost lost the eagle as a result of that. And then the other thing that Crop Life America industry lobbying group says, data are extensive, exposure is low. It takes a high level to see an effect. They did not acknowledge hormesis. We have a lot of data. We don't have a lot of data on children, but it doesn't affect adults. So why would it affect children? So why are we seeing this? We're seeing these are the kind of problems that are going on out there, but some of it has been hushed up. You don't hear a lot of talk about it. So let's go back to Philip Landrigan, who said, typically what will happen is you get a smart chemist who develops a new product, sees that it's useful, puts it in consumer goods, and then it gets disseminated wildly in the marketplace. Then 15 years, 20 years later, we realize it's toxic. But at that point, the company is making billions of dollars. So you go back to that company and say, you really should stop this. R.J. Reynolds and your cigarette. Cigarettes are bad for you. Really? Are you sure? Let's do some studies. How about we do studies for the next 15, 20 years? Because we're making a lot of money selling that chemical. And an example of this, anybody ever heard of diethylstilbestrol? DES was manufactured as a hormone modulator and became used as a prescription drug for pregnant women to help them keep their pregnancy, even though it was never proven that it kept the pregnancy. And then what happened? They started realizing that little girls that were born to mothers that had taken DES had vaginal cancer and very high incidence and had all kinds of vaginal abnormalities. So the mother didn't notice anything, right? She was a very good little lab rat. No problems in the mom, but the offspring had problems, and the offspring of the offspring had problems. So we know that DES is it was really the beginning of this notion of an endocrine disruptor, of a chemical that could, talk to the receptors in the wrong way and cause a problem. So that was the first drug that came along. The second one is something called bisphenol A. Anybody heard of it? Bisphenol A was developed as a drug, my friends. It was developed as a drug, and the only reason it didn't go into widespread use as a prescription drug is because DES was also discovered at the same time, and they realized it was a little bit more potent. So they said, okay, we're not going to go with bisphenol A, we'll go with DES instead. And then there was a whole debacle with DES before it finally got taken off the market. It's still used for a couple things. I think it's used to treat some kind of cancer, weird prostate cancers or things like that. But, certainly not used for the original purpose. So bisphenol A, they said, oh, well, what are we going to do? So they put it on a shelf. Years later, somebody figured out if you polymerize it, you start putting a lot of these molecules together, it makes this nice enamel, and you can put it in canned foods. So now 90% of the canned foods in this country are lined with a hormone disruptor, bisphenol A. And when you heat the food in those cans, it starts to leach out. No safety testing whatsoever. Now released 8 billion pounds a year. I'm not making this up. 8 billion pounds a year. So it's in these polycarbonate bottles. It's in compact disc. It's in refrigerator shelving. What's a dental sealant? You've heard of these things? Yeah, and so they're saying, oh, bisphenol A is a problem. We're going to use bisphenol B or bisphenol C. Do you think those are fun? Right, so this is kind of how it starts. It starts innocently enough, and then it gets out of control, and nobody ever thinks to do the studies to ask whether it leaches out. Well, there's a guy named Vom Saal who's done a huge amount of research on this. And, did I mention that cash register receipts are coated with bisphenol A? Ew. So the next time you go shopping, take your little tongs with you to get those receipts, because it's the shiny receipts. It's a thermal paper, and the shiny receipts are coated with bisphenol A. And it turns out that's the receipt on the left there. If you use hand sanitizer and then you touch the receipt, it doubles the absorption. Oh no, Dr. Doom, I told you. And then what happens if you go to Mickey D's, you get your burger and your fries, and then you go, my hands are probably nasty, so you get the hand sanitizer and you put it on, and then you're putting the receipt away, and then you eat the fries. Right? So it all ends up in the bloodstream. It's all enhancing the absorption. Where's the problem? In somebody who works retail. If you think about the person working at McDonald's, they're handing out these receipts all day long, and their BPA levels are pretty high. So who cares? Well, the first thing is 90% of us have bisphenol A, measurable amounts in our urine. We're all excreting BPA. The Canadian government is saying maybe this should be banned. Why can you ban something that makes a lot of money for people? It's a conflict of interest. We know that it can interfere with estrogen signaling. We know that children are really susceptible. And high levels have been linked to heart disease, diabetes, liver inflammation, cancer, thyroid disorders, obesity, infertility. Look at this paper from the Quack Journal of the American Medical Association, 2012. Association between urinary BPA and obesity in children and adolescents. So when they looked at urinary BPA and measured how fat the kids were, it totally tracked in parallel. And this is something that's it's not going away. We're exposed to this every single day. Ever heard of phthalates? But I could go on. I'm not going to go on too much longer on this stuff, but it's important for you to get an idea of how many different variations there are on. What are phthalates? They're used to make PVC, polyvinyl chloride, more pliable. So they're in all kinds of plastics. They're in pop bottles, they're in water bottles, they're in microwave containers, they're in cling wrap, they're in IVs, the IV tubing that makes the tubing so flexible. That's phthalates. And they end up in our bloodstream. Oh, and they use it as enteric coating in medication. Isn't that brilliant? As they say in the UK, brilliant. Just brilliant, so that we can eat it. And they work a lot like bisphenol A. They're endocrine disruptors. Personal care products. Here's what I always say with this. When you put something on your skin, you have to ask yourself the question, would I eat this? Because you are eating it. Whatever you put up, whatever you wash your hair with, if you paint your nails, you are eating it. I'm sorry. I mean, there was a study done in women that had to have breast biopsies and mastectomies, and they measured parabens, which are found in personal care products. And they found it in areas right around where you would have thought that they were applying creams, etc. So these phthalates were going right into the tissue. And I think the more recent study showed there was a higher incidence of phthalates the closer you got to actual breast cancers. I'm sorry, I said phthalates, parabens, which are similar kind of things. So read your labels, friends. Because what we're looking at are endocrine disruptors. The World Health Organization, the endocrinologists are all on board with this. Who's not on board with this? The toxicologists. Who pays the toxicologists? Take a guess. Syngenta, Dow Chemical, Monsanto support the toxicology journals. I'm sorry, I'm not. Am I making this up? If anybody thinks I'm making it up, I will give you the data. So the endocrinologists are having it out with the toxicologists in the journals because the endocrinologists are saying, wait a minute, we've got an increase in endocrine-related disorders. I showed you that. Girls going through early puberty. Is this because we have more bad genes? We didn't have those genes before. They magically appeared out of nowhere. Now we all have these bad genes. It has nothing to do with the environment. It's just bad genes. Okay? These environmental disruptors, endocrine disruptors, don't just work on estrogen or testosterone, but also on thyroid, also on pancreas. Any organ you could think of can be disrupted. Okay? So here's the question. How is it possible that these low doses could cause a problem? You know, again, this hormetic effect. I mean, we're talking about parts per billion. How is it possible that's a problem? Well, I measure hormones in my patients all the time, and a typical hormone level you're looking at is like nanograms or picograms per ml. That's parts per billion. How much is, just to give you an idea, what is a part per billion? That's the equivalent of 1 drop of water in an Olympic swimming pool. You ever heard of something called premenstrual syndrome? Right? It's apparently a disorder that, the premenstrual dysphoric disorder, that's what they call it now. And what is it, right? It's a mood change as a result of a very slight shift in estrogen or progesterone. So instead of 1 drop of water in the Olympic swimming pool, there's 2 drops. So if you've ever experienced a mood shift as a result of a hormonal thing, just think about it. I just went from 1 drop to 2 in a swimming pool. So if our bodies are that sensitive to these tiny amounts of naturally occurring hormones, how sensitive do you think we are to bisphenol A or phthalates or parabens or DES, etc.? Right? We're talking trillionths of a gram that our body is exquisitely tuned to recognize. Exquisitely tuned. So that, to me, explains what's going on with hormesis. It's like when you get to really high levels, you've saturated all those receptors. So, the body is no longer, is now resistant. Nothing's happening. But when you're down at the level of a couple of drops in the swimming pool, the receptors aren't even beginning to be saturated. So slight changes can turn on entire cellular response mechanisms. Safe levels of pesticides, based on this linear model, are typically measured in parts per billion or parts per million. So this is, a parts per billion can be 1,000 or even 1,000,000 times greater than the amount of naturally occurring hormones. So our body's totally tuned into this. So that's my argument, again, to the toxicologist to say, dose is too low, doesn't make a difference. Well, what about Dr. Hayes' study? Dilute urine can castrate 100,000, 200,000 frogs at the same time. So biological effects of toxicants are not linear. You can totally apply that to mercury or cadmium or lead or organic chemicals, etc. And chemical sensitivity varies very considerably depending on your life stage, your biochemical individuality, how often you poop, whether you got bacteria in your gut. Some people don't. Some people live off antibiotics. That totally changes your ability to detoxify. So all of these things need to be taken into consideration. So this is from a journal of the Public Health Reports. Demonstration of biological effects at very low levels of exposure suggests 2 axioms of toxicology started by Paracelsus. 1, that all chemicals have thresholds below which they cause no adverse effects, needs to be challenged, because we know these low doses can have an effect. And 2, the dose makes the poison, needs to be completely reevaluated. So here's how I think about disease risk in my patients. Toxic potency is only part of it. Cumulative exposure and susceptibility are also a major part of the equation. You have to think about all of these things together. I'm sure there's people out there that can have a whole mouthful of mercury and they're just fine. There was an article in the newspaper about a husband and wife couple. This woman was exposed to arsenic because they were doing a remodel in their house. And so they were working in the shed and they were cutting this arsenic-treated wood, right? She's breathing in this arsenic-treated wood every day. She gets sick as a dog. Her white blood count goes down. She's losing hair. Her nails are getting weird lines. And she's just terribly ill. So she ends up in the hospital. They do a test, say her arsenic levels are through the roof. And they say, somebody must be trying to kill you. And they said, we think it's your husband. And she says, I know the guy. If he wanted to kill me, he would just shoot me. But nevertheless, they arrest the guy, put him in jail. They arrest the guy, no evidence. Then they do his arsenic levels. His are higher than hers. He's a guy. I didn't feel nothing, right? I'm okay. So everybody is a little bit different. When I evaluate patients, I think in terms of the total toxic load. So this whole lecture has kind of been leading towards this notion of all these mixtures together. And everybody, every individual has got a total toxic load that is a result of their elimination capabilities, a result of their built-in enzyme systems, a result of the nutrients that they take in, how much glutathione they have. So this is a very useful notion for you to evaluate patients. And it helps explain to a patient when you're saying to them, gee, you know, I think you should get this mercury out or it's a problem. Well, I feel fine. Well, you may feel fine now, right? But all it takes is one more insult. Maybe you're feeling fine today. Tomorrow you go spray your yard with some Roundup and you can't get out of bed. And then you go, it was the Roundup. Well, the Roundup precipitated it, but the total toxic load was the setup. Are you with me on that? That's why it's such a useful concept that's showing up in the literature. And the total toxic load is now actually, it's not being replaced, but it's being deepened by this notion of the exposome. So the exposome is the combination of everything you're exposed to. Radiation, stress, do you smoke? How much do you drink? Do you have chronic infections? Do you take medications? You know, you're exposed to air pollution. And then what's your gut like? Are you making toxins in your gut? Do you have unhealthy bacteria in your gut? The exposome puts all that data together, and you're just starting to see this emerge in the scientific literature. That's the term you want to look for, exposome. A very, very useful concept. This is from an ad, Mount Sinai School of Medicine. Chemicals combined in our body, but they're rarely tested that way. Why? The future of toxicology has got to be to look at the total load in an individual, to look at as many things as you can and not just look at one thing. Okay? We look at synergistic effects of toxins. If a person smokes, the risk of lung cancer goes up 10 times. If they are exposed to asbestos, 5 times. But if they're exposed to asbestos and they smoke, it goes up 55 times. And this is just one of many examples that I can give you. Again, back to Stephen Gilbert. Sensitivity of the individual differentiates a poison from a remedy. The fundamental principle of toxicology. Get this. The fundamental principle of toxicology is the individual's response to a dose. Not some other level that says that's fine. How does the individual respond is the only thing that matters in toxicology. So we need to completely revamp the whole way we study things like mercury, cadmium, lead, bisphenol A, and we need to start looking at it from an individual-centered perspective. The government sets standards and says, okay, if we widen this out to what's called a 2 sigma variation, 99% of people are not going to be affected. And so let's make that a little wider, and we're going to get most people. But what about the people that aren't the most people? Right? Individuals that are harmed by these really low dose exposures, and in many cases that's children. Right? We also have to acknowledge how many unknowns there are. What we don't know is really huge compared to the actual data, and it's changing all of the time. So that leads us to kind of my final point, which is that we need to operate under what's called the precautionary principle. They use this a lot in Europe, but there's been a big fight in our Congress now about adopting this. The whole notion is if a company comes up with a new chemical, they have to prove that it's safe before they can release it. You're like, really? You don't have to do that? No, I mean, right now, you come up with a new chemical and you go, well, this is really promising. Let's see, if I develop this as a drug, it's going to cost me, what, $20, $30 million at least to bring it out as a drug. If I make it as an agricultural chemical, if I put it in food or I line it with cans, I don't have to do any research on it. Well, let me think about that. So the precautionary principle says any new chemical that gets released, if there's any chance of harm, take it off the market. We have a hard time getting rid of asbestos despite the research on it. So the burden of proof should be on the manufacturer and not on the public. Are you with me on that? I think it's a very powerful concept. So, this is the fight that's going on. The public says, prove that it's safe. The toxicologists say, we have to prove that it's not safe. Once something's on the market, it's really hard to prove that it's not safe. Right? And that's the whole dilemma. Those are French fries? Yes. But why do they taste so good? They do. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with something positive so that you don't just feel like you want to go shoot yourself after this lecture. Okay, so, I do a lot of detox stuff, and I think Dr. Shade's got great ideas about what do you do with a person that's really ill. What about the average person that's saying, what do I do? Here's things that I recommend for everybody. Everybody should either eat probiotic foods, kombucha, pickled foods, or take a probiotic. Everybody should take prebiotic fibers like chia, flax, oats. Most everybody, I think, would benefit from eating algae, green algae, seaweed, eating broccoli, watercress every day, drinking green tea, using curcumin from turmeric, consuming a little bit of pomegranate juice, raspberries, strawberries, a little red wine, or if you don't do alcohol, purple grape juice, organic chocolate. Yes. Milk thistle, N-acetylcysteine is certainly at the top of my list, and so is alpha-lipoic acid. So those three are all winners in my book, and vitamin D should be a winner in everybody's book. So this is just a simple, basic regimen that I would say anybody and everybody could benefit from. And then some parting advice from Cornelius Celsus, who advised Emperor Tiberius in the 1st century AD. Number 1, live in rooms full of light. Number 2, avoid heavy food. Be moderate in the drinking of wine. Take massage, baths, exercise, and gymnastics. Fight insomnia with gentle rocking or the sound of running water. Change surroundings and take long journeys. Indulge in cheerful conversation and amusements. Listen to music. And above all, strictly avoid frightening ideas. Thank you very much.